There are names in the Imperium that never truly die. They are spoken in prayer, carved into adamantium hulls, etched into the genetic memory of entire chapters. A Primarch's name can rally fleets, steady worlds on the brink of collapse, and justify wars that burn for centuries. But names have gravity, and sometimes that gravity is strong enough to pull entire star systems down with it. Long after a Primarch's body is gone, slain, vanished, entombed, or mythologized, their legacy continues to move through the Imperium like a slow contagion. It shapes doctrine, hardens traditions, and turns survival strategies into sacred lore. In some regions of space, that inheritance saves billions. In others, it quietly dooms them. Because a Primarch's legacy is never just history. It is a living force, enforced by belief, obedience, and the terrifying refusal of the Imperium to ever admit that one of its gods may have been wrong. If stories like this, where Warhammer 40,000 lore bleeds into consequence, faith, and quiet catastrophe, are why you're here, then take a moment to support the channel. A like, a share, or a subscription helps keep these deeper, darker narratives alive, reaching others who want more than surface-level battles and named characters. These stories only endure if they are carried forward. The system did not appear cursed on any star chart. Its worlds orbited obediently, its trade routes remained technically intact, and its tithe records, though always strained, were never delinquent enough to warrant immediate sanction. From orbit, the primary planet looked like countless others. A scarred sphere wrapped in cloud and pollution, its night side stitched with the dim glow of hive cities that had learned to ration even their light. What made it different was not what it produced, but what it remembered. Every child born under its ash-heavy sky learned the same truth before they could read a data slate or recite their first catechism. A Primarch had once stood here, and because of that, nothing else ever truly moved on. The name was spoken daily, sometimes reverently, sometimes casually, sometimes with the weary familiarity of a burden long carried. It adorned manufactorum gates and regimental banners alike, carved deep into ferrocrete, so it would outlast any governor or generation. Shrines dotted the lower habs, where lumen strips flickered unreliably, each one depicting the Primarch not as they truly were, but as the system needed them to be: unyielding, flawless, eternal. No two depictions were identical, but all conveyed the same message: endure, obey, do not adapt unless commanded by history itself. For the people who lived there, legacy was not an abstraction. It dictated shift rotations, ration allotments, and even acceptable forms of complaint. Hunger was not a logistical failure, it was a test. Equipment shortages were not mismanagement. They were reminders of purity through deprivation. When accidents claimed lives in the manufactorums, the dead were praised for mirroring the Primarch's legendary tolerance for pain, their families encouraged to feel pride rather than anger. Grief, like everything else, was shaped into something useful. The Astra Militarum regiments, raised from the system, were known across nearby sectors for their discipline and predictability. They advanced in the same formations described in half-remembered campaign texts. They favored specific patterns of lasgun drill and armored support, because deviation, however sensible, was quietly discouraged. Officers learned early that innovation invited scrutiny, while adherence earned praise. Many of them genuinely believed it was the Primarch's will guiding their choices. Others simply understood that survival within the system's hierarchy required reverence, masquerading as strategy. Even the planet's manufactoria bore the weight of inherited doctrine. Skitarii overseers monitored output with machine precision, yet production lines remained locked to patterns centuries out of date. The Primarch's legacy had become a kind of sacred template, immune to efficiency arguments. Better to produce the wrong weapons faithfully than the right ones irreverently. Children grew up surrounded by this quiet rigidity. In Scholams, they memorized fragments of the Primarch's campaigns before learning broader imperial history. They were taught that survival had been earned once, through absolute obedience, and that it could only be preserved the same way. Those who asked why conditions never improved were reminded that improvement was not the goal. Continuation was. The system still stood. That alone was proof enough. Pressure arrived gradually, the way it always does in the Imperium. Orc raids along the outer shipping lanes disrupted supply convoys, forcing tighter rationing. Administratum delays rerouted reinforcements elsewhere to fronts deemed more strategically valuable. Necron activity was rumored in distant systems, spoken of in hushed tones by voidfarers who never stayed long. Each new strain exposed cracks in infrastructure that had been papered over by faith and familiarity. Each time, the response was the same. Invoke the Primarch, tighten discipline, endure harder. There were those who sensed the danger early. A logistics officer noticed casualty projections climbing despite unchanged tactics. A manufactorum adept quietly calculated that output losses could not be sustained another decade without systemic collapse. An Astra Militarum captain watched her company bleed itself white, following maneuvers better suited to enemies long extinct. None of them spoke openly. To question the legacy was to question the system's identity, and identity, once sanctified, becomes untouchable. At night, when the manufactoria quieted and the hive's endless machinery dipped into a rare lull, the planet seemed to hold its breath. Wind carried the smell of promethium and rust through broken spires, stirring prayer strips and tattered banners bearing a name older than the cities beneath them. The people slept beneath that name, dreamed beneath it, and woke each day ready to suffer in its honor. They did not know they were already paying for a debt centuries overdue. And far beyond their sky, threats continued to move, indifferent to legacy, unimpressed by memory, waiting patiently for the moment when reverence finally outweighed survival. The first sign that the system's inheritance was becoming a noose did not come as invasion or omen. It came as paperwork. A sealed administratum missive arrived in the governor's palace, its wax marked with the imperial aquila, its language crisp with bureaucratic certainty. It informed the system, politely, immovably, that its next tithe would increase. More material, more recruits, more promethium. The justification was simple. Other systems had fallen. This one still stood. Therefore, this one could give more. The governor read the missive twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change the words. Around him, robed functionaries murmured calculations into data slates. The margin of survivability was already thin. Increasing tithe demands meant pulling food from hab blocks that already rationed between hunger and starvation. It meant stripping manufactoria of spare parts they could not afford to lose. It meant drafting bodies from the lower levels where life expectancy was measured in decades at best. In any rational system, such an order would prompt negotiation. In the Imperium, negotiation was a kind of fantasy. The governor's advisors proposed the usual solutions: tighten quotas, reduce civilian allocations, double shifts, frame it as duty, frame it as honor, frame it as the Primarch's will. The name was spoken almost reflexively, as if invoking it could stabilize the numbers. And for a moment, it seemed to work. Not in reality, but in morale. The ecclesiarchy seized the announcement immediately, preaching that the increase proved the emperor's trust, that the system had been judged worthy of greater burden. Citizens were told to celebrate their suffering. They did, because celebration was safer than despair. Down in the lower Habs, the sainted legacy manifested in simpler ways. New posters appeared overnight, cheap ink on recycled parchment, depicting the Primarch's stern profile above slogans about endurance. Food lines grew longer. Water was cut an hour earlier each cycle. Families began selling heirlooms, small scraps of metal stamped with devotional iconography, to afford black market protein bars that tasted of chalk and oil. And still, people repeated the same phrases. The Primarch endured worse. The Primarch demanded purity. The Primarch would not complain. Within the Astra Militarum barracks, the order translated into recruitment drives that felt less like enlistment and more like harvesting. Commissars walked the Hab levels with data slates, tallying names and ages, while ecclesiarchal attendants followed behind, offering blessings that sounded suspiciously like final rites. Young men and women were marched to muster points beneath banners bearing the Primarch's sigil, told they were part of something eternal. Some were proud, some were terrified, most were simply numb. The system had always consumed its own. Now it did so faster. A captain named Maelia Vaughan watched it happen with the detached horror of someone who could read the math. Her regiment had been raised on this world, indoctrinated from childhood to treat adherence as virtue and improvisation as weakness. She had believed it once, believed it fiercely. Then she had watched friends die in formations that made sense only in the pages of old campaign texts. She had watched orcs tear through a flank because the prescribed response required a maneuver too slow for a living enemy. She had watched a victory recorded as proof of doctrine, while the bodies were shoveled into mass graves behind the bastion walls. Now Maelia stood in a dim-lit muster hall, listening as a priest recited a litany over new recruits. Their faces were drawn and hungry. Their uniforms hung loose. They looked like people already half erased by the system they were being sworn to defend. Maelia's hands tightened behind her back. The words spoken over them were beautiful in their way, poetic, ancient, practiced, but they were also a denial of reality. The litany promised that endurance was enough. Maelia knew endurance could run out. When she raised concerns to her superior, she did so carefully, framing them as logistical. Supply lines were failing. Reinforcement schedules were unrealistic. Tactical doctrine needed adjustment to match the threats actually present. Her superior listened, expression unreadable, then reminded her that doctrine was legacy, and legacy was sanctified. To alter it was to imply the Primarch's methods were insufficient. That implication, he warned, would not be tolerated. Maelia left the chamber with her jaw clenched and her stomach hollow, realizing she had not been corrected. She had been warned. In the Manufactoria, the pressure reached breaking points faster than anyone admitted. Skitarii patrols increased, their footsteps metallic echoes in corridors thick with heat and machine oil. Servitors were pushed beyond safe cycles, collapsing mid-task with sparks spilling from split cranial plates. Workers began fainting at their stations, bodies hauled aside so production could continue. The overseer Margos issued no speeches. It simply adjusted quotas upward, and let the system bleed itself to meet them. Efficiency did not care if the components were human. And through it all, the Primarch's name remained everywhere, carved into walls, stitched onto banners, spoken at the beginning and end of every shift. It was meant to be an anchor. Instead, it became a weight. The system could not adapt because adaptation implied imperfection in what had been inherited. So it tightened its grip on the past, even as the present began to collapse beneath it. By the time the first major convoy failed to arrive, its ships destroyed in a raid that the old patrol patterns had not anticipated, the system was already locked into its response. The governor called for increased discipline. The ecclesiarchy called for deeper devotion. The Astra Militarum called for stricter adherence. And Captain Meliavorn stood in the shadow of a banner bearing a Primarch's sigil, feeling something in her faith begin to shift, not toward rebellion, but toward a colder, sharper question. What if the legacy they worshipped was not saving them, but consuming them? The convoy's destruction was not announced immediately. Losses like that were rarely framed as events. They were treated as absences, felt before they were named. Fuel reserves dipped faster than projections allowed. Munitorum clerks quietly reclassified ration tiers. Vox traffic from the outer system went silent, then resumed with too much cheer and not enough detail. People noticed the change in the taste of recycled water before they heard the official explanation. By the time the governor addressed the system, most citizens already understood what had happened. They had lived with scarcity too long not to recognize its shadow. The address was delivered from a balcony overlooking the capital hive's central plaza. Banners bearing the Primarch's sigil unfurled in disciplined symmetry. The governor spoke of resilience, of proving worthiness under strain, of honoring the Primarch not with comfort, but with endurance. His voice carried well, amplified through vox grills, tuned to reverent clarity. The crowd responded as expected, a low murmur of assent rolling outward like a practiced reflex. Captain Meliavorn listened from the edge of the plaza, helmet tucked beneath her arm, and felt the words settle over the people like a familiar shroud. No one asked how long endurance was supposed to last. Orders followed quickly. Patrol routes reverted fully to the oldest recorded patterns, the ones attributed directly to the Primarch's campaigns. Resource allocation was centralized further, removing what little flexibility remained at the local level. Requests for deviation were not denied outright. They were returned with annotations citing historical precedent, each one a reminder that the past had already solved problems. The present insisted on reintroducing. The system folded inward, reinforcing its inherited shape, even as external pressure mounted. Maelia's regiment was deployed to the outer industrial belts soon after, tasked with reinforcing positions along a corridor deemed symbolically significant. The logic was sound only if one valued memory over mathematics. The enemy, orcs by confirmed report, their raids growing bolder, did not respect symbols. They followed opportunity. Maelia stood on a rusted gantry overlooking the deployment zone and watched her soldiers take their positions exactly as prescribed, their movements crisp, their spacing immaculate. It looked impressive. It always did. That was the danger. When the attack came, it was brutal and unrefined, a surge of violence that tore into the formation's exposed flank. The prescribed response required a maneuver that depended on support that no longer existed, support lost when the convoy burned. Maelia gave the order to adjust anyway, choosing survival over sanctity, and felt the moment stretch thin as her command traveled down the line. Some units responded instantly, others hesitated, drilled too deeply in obedience to question deviation without confirmation from above. That hesitation cost lives. The engagement ended in a hard-fought withdrawal, recorded officially as a successful delay. Casualty figures were adjusted to fit acceptable thresholds. Commendations were issued for discipline under fire. Maelia stood among the wounded afterward, the air thick with the coppery smell of blood and the sour tang of burned insulation, and realized that the system was no longer measuring success by what it preserved. It was measuring it by how closely reality could be forced to resemble doctrine. That night, back within the hive's walls, the banners still hung, the shrines still burned, children still recited the Primarch's name in their evening prayers. Nothing visible had changed, and yet something fundamental had shifted. The legacy that once provided identity now demanded sacrifice without limit, adaptation without alteration, obedience without outcome. The world had inherited a name. It had also inherited a fate. And as new threats gathered beyond the system's borders, indifferent to reverence and unimpressed by history, that fate began to close in, not as sudden annihilation, but as the slow, grinding consequence of a past that refused to let the present breathe. The shift became impossible to ignore after that withdrawal. It lingered in the way officers spoke more carefully in briefing chambers, in how junior logisticians avoided eye contact when presenting projections that no longer aligned with official optimism. The system was still functioning, but only in the way a machine continues to run after a critical component has begun to crack, every motion accelerating the damage it was meant to conceal. Captain Maelia Vaughan felt it most clearly during the next doctrinal review, when her after-action report was returned with entire sections redacted, replaced by citations from campaign records attributed to the Primarch. Her tactical reasoning was not debated. It was overwritten. She stood in the review chamber beneath a towering relief of the Primarch's sigil, its edges worn smooth by centuries of reverent touch. The officer presiding over the session spoke calmly, almost kindly, explaining that deviations, even successful ones, introduced uncertainty. Uncertainty, he reminded her, was the enemy of unity. The Primarch had achieved victory through clarity of purpose, through methods refined by divine design. To survive now, the system must reflect that clarity, not dilute it with situational improvisation. Maelia listened, nodded, and understood that her loyalty was no longer being measured by results. It was being measured by resemblance. Outside the chamber, the hive continued its relentless rhythm. Manufactorum sirens wailed, signaling shift changes that blurred together into a single, endless cycle. Servitors dragged their failing frames across grated floors, leaking oil and ichor in equal measure. Citizens moved through corridors plastered with devotional notices, announcing new days of fasting, new quotas of sacrifice, each one framed as a privilege inherited from the Primarch's example. The language of devotion had become indistinguishable from the language of rationing. In the lower levels, where light struggled to penetrate layers of ferrocrete and neglect, resentment began to take shape, not openly, not as rebellion, but as exhaustion stripped of reverence. People still prayed, they still bowed their heads at the sound of hymns piped through vox grills, but the prayers grew shorter. The silences between them grew longer. Faith was no longer sustaining them. It was explaining why nothing ever improved. The Astra Militarum felt the strain acutely. Replacement troops arrived under-strength and under-trained, their equipment stamped with patterns decades out of date. Officers were instructed to emphasize legacy in their briefings, to remind soldiers that hardship was proof of worth. Maelia watched recruits repeat the words back during drills, their voices hollow, their eyes already dulled by hunger. She wondered how long discipline could substitute for hope before it collapsed into something far more dangerous. The final moment of clarity came quietly. Malia received a sealed notice informing her that her regiment would be reassigned to a defensive posture deemed symbolically essential to the system's identity. The position was indefensible by any modern standard. Its value derived entirely from a historical footnote, linking it to the Primarch's campaign centuries earlier. Holding it would cost lives. Losing it would be recorded as shame. There was no version of the order that did not end in blood. She folded the notice carefully and placed it inside her coat, feeling the weight of it settle against her chest. Around her, the hive's ancient machinery groaned and clattered, banners stirring faintly in recycled air. The Primarch's name echoed from distant loudspeakers, steady and unwavering, as if it alone could hold the system together. Malia realized then what no sermon would ever admit. The legacy that had once given this world purpose had become a fixed point it could not orbit without tearing itself apart. The system was no longer fighting enemies beyond its borders. It was fighting the past, and losing. The order to hold the symbolically essential position was framed as an honor. It arrived wrapped in ecclesiarchal language and administratum sealwork, its phrasing dense with reverence and inevitability. Captain Malia Vaughan read it in silence, while a junior officer waited at attention, the faint hum of lumen strips filling the pauses between her breaths. The position itself was a ruin, an elevated ridge of ferrocrete and shattered manufactorum towers overlooking a corridor the enemy no longer favored. It had once mattered. That was enough. The Primarch had advanced through this ground during a campaign that existed now only in fragments of text and ritualized retelling. To abandon it would be to admit that history could be wrong. Preparation followed doctrine rather than intelligence. Supply manifests were finalized according to precedent, not need. Defensive emplacements were restored to prescribed configurations, their angles and fields of fire optimized for threats long extinct. When Malia requested additional anti-armor assets to compensate for the corridor's exposure, the request returned with a polite denial and a citation from a campaign chronicle attributed to the Primarch's own hand. The implication was clear. If the Primarch had held this ground with less, then the regiment could do no less without betraying the legacy they served. The soldiers felt it immediately. They always did. Faith communicated itself faster than orders. As the regiment deployed, banners bearing the Primarch's sigil were raised first, their fabric stiff with age and incense. The men and women moved into position with disciplined precision, murmuring the old phrases under their breath. Endurance is victory. Suffering is proof. Obedience is survival. The words had comforted generations. Now they sounded like instructions for dying correctly. Malia walked the line at dusk, boots crunching over debris that still bore scorch marks centuries old. She spoke quietly to her troops, offering reassurance without lies, reminding them to watch their angles, to conserve ammunition, to trust one another rather than abstractions. Some met her eyes with gratitude. Others looked past her, toward the banners, as if waiting for permission she could no longer give. The legacy had taught them where authority truly lived. The attack came at night, sudden and loud. Orc engines roaring like tearing metal as crude vehicles slammed against the outer defenses. The first wave broke exactly as doctrine predicted. The second did not. Orcs adapted faster than the system allowed itself to admit. Pouring through blind spots, the The prescribed formations could not cover without deviation. Millennium ordered adjustments, voice sharp over the vox, and felt the delay as confirmations were routed up the chain. The system hesitated. The enemy did not. When the line finally bent, it did so unevenly. Units drilled to respond only to sanctioned commands held too long, their discipline turning into paralysis. Others broke formation to cover gaps, acting on instinct rather than instruction. Those units survived longer. The pattern was unmistakable. The price of obedience was being paid in blood. By dawn, the position still held. Officially, it was a success. The orcs had been repelled. The banners still flew. In the after-action briefing, losses were framed as proof of commitment. The regiment praised for honoring the Primarch through steadfast adherence. No one mentioned that the ground itself no longer mattered. No one asked whether the cost had achieved anything beyond symbolism. After the briefing, Millennium stood alone on the ridge, watching smoke drift across a sky that never fully cleared. Below her, Medicae teams worked in silence, their movements efficient and exhausted. She felt the old teachings press in around her, familiar and suffocating. Doctrine had hardened into law, and law had become immune to evidence. The Primarch's legacy was no longer a guide. It was a verdict, delivered daily, enforced without appeal. Somewhere in the system, scribes updated records, noting another instance of faithful endurance. Somewhere else, new orders were being drafted, citing this engagement as precedent. The past was teaching the future how to repeat itself more efficiently. Millennium turned away from the ridge as the banners snapped in recycled wind, knowing with grim certainty that the system had crossed a threshold it could not retreat from. From here on, every choice would be measured not by what it saved, but by how closely it resembled memory. The consequences unfolded not as reprimand, but as refinement. Doctrine did not change in response to the engagement. It crystallized. The engagement was cited, excerpted, and redistributed through the system's command networks as a model of correct conduct under strain. The casualties were not treated as warning signs, but as acceptable losses sanctified by adherence. The fact that survival had depended on moments of unsanctioned adaptation was quietly excised from the narrative, smoothed away by careful wording and selective omission. What remained was a cleaner story, one that taught exactly the lesson the system preferred to learn. Captain Vaughan felt the shift immediately in the days that followed. Briefings grew shorter, more declarative. Questions were acknowledged without being answered. Tactical flexibility was no longer discouraged merely by tradition. It was now framed as spiritually destabilizing. Officers were reminded that unity of action reflected unity of belief, and that belief, once fractured, could not be easily repaired. The language was calm, almost soothing, which made it all the more final. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Within the Astra Militarum ranks, the effect was corrosive. Soldiers who had survived by acting on instinct learned to keep quiet about it. Those who had followed doctrine to the letter and lost comrades were praised publicly, their grief wrapped in honorifics until it resembled virtue. Medals were issued in abundance, thin metal discs pressed into shaking hands beside sealed notices, informing families that their sacrifices had been recorded and approved. Approval, in the Imperium, often substituted for justice. The system's governors took the lesson further. Emergency powers were extended indefinitely, justified by the need to preserve doctrinal purity during crisis. Resource allocation was tightened again, this time with fewer apologies. Civilian protests, small, localized, easily contained, were reframed as failures of faith rather than responses to hunger. Ecclesiastical sermons emphasized obedience not as a means to survival, but as survival itself. The distinction mattered less with each passing day. Malia watched it happen from within the machine, her position granting her a view most never saw. She saw requisition requests denied because they did not align with historical ratios. She saw casualty figures adjusted to fit acceptable patterns. She saw young officers promoted not for competence, but for their ability to quote doctrine without hesitation. The Primarch's legacy had become a metric, and metrics, once institutionalized, are difficult to argue with. On the streets below the barracks, the change manifested more quietly. Shrines multiplied, candles burned longer, people prayed harder, not because they believed more deeply, but because prayer was one of the few actions still permitted that felt like agency. In the lower habs, children learned to lower their voices when asking questions. Curiosity had become a liability. Endurance, once a shared burden, was now a moral requirement enforced by shame. The next deployment orders arrived sooner than expected. Another position of symbolic importance. Another opportunity to prove fidelity. The cycle was accelerating, each engagement feeding the next, each loss reinforcing the same conclusion. The system was no longer trying to win. It was trying to remain itself. Malia folded the orders and stared at the Primarch's sigil embossed on the header, its familiar lines suddenly alien. She understood then that doctrine had not simply hardened into law. It had replaced judgment entirely. There would be no moment where someone in authority admitted the cost was too high, because the cost itself had become the point. As preparations began anew, and banners were raised once more, Malia felt a cold clarity settle in her chest. This was not collapse. This was sustainability of the worst kind. A system capable of enduring indefinitely while devouring itself, all in the name of a legacy that no longer remembered why it had begun. The second position was worse, not because it was more dangerous, but because it was emptier. A stretch of blasted ground anchored by the remains of a shrine fortress, its walls cracked and half swallowed by dust, its strategic value long eclipsed by shifting fronts. What remained was meaning. The Primarch had paused here once, according to the records, long enough to issue an order, long enough for later generations to build an entire narrative around that moment. Now the system was expected to bleed for it. Malia arrived ahead of the main force, walking the perimeter with a small escort, while dawn struggled through a sky stained permanently amber by pollution. The shrine's interior smelled of old incense and damp stone. Faded murals depicted the Primarch in impossible proportions, towering above kneeling soldiers who all bore the same idealized face. None of them looked like the men and women Malia commanded now. Those soldiers were thinner, older before their time, their armor patched and repatched until the original markings were barely visible. Legacy did not account for wear. As the regiment dug in, Malia noted the same pattern repeating with unnerving precision. Emplacements placed according to scripture rather than terrain. Firing arcs chosen because they matched diagrams rather than lines of sight. When she quietly adjusted a single heavy weapons nest to cover an obvious blind approach, an ecclesiastical observer took note. The correction was small. The scrutiny was not. Later that day, Malia was reminded, politely, that any deviation required formal justification to ensure doctrinal alignment. The enemy, she thought, would not be filing paperwork. The assault came at dusk, not with the feral roar of orcs this time, but with disciplined, grinding inevitability. Enemy artillery bracketed the shrine fortress with unnerving accuracy, collapsing sections that doctrine insisted should hold. Communications faltered, Smoke turned orders into guesses. In the confusion, Malia issued commands that contradicted prescribed response patterns, prioritizing withdrawal over symbolic holding actions. Some units complied instantly, others hesitated, caught between her voice and the echo of centuries of instruction. That hesitation again cost lives. When the firing finally tapered off, the shrine still stood, barely. Officially, the position had been held. Unofficially, the regiment had been mauled. Medici worked until their hands shook, triaging bodies whose injuries no longer matched the heroic narratives that would soon be written about them. Malia stood among the wounded, listening to prayers whispered through clenched teeth, and felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Not grief alone, recognition. The after-action report was delivered before the dead were even cleared. The engagement was classified as exemplary. Commendations were authorized. The system had not simply ignored reality, it had overwritten it, and in doing so, it ensured that the next engagement would be fought the same way. That night, Maelia climbed the shrine's highest remaining tower and looked out over the battlefield. Fires still burned in the distance, their light flickering against the banners below. The Primarch's sigil caught the glow and reflected it back, pristine and untarnished, as if nothing beneath it had changed. She wondered, not for the first time, whether the Primarch themselves would recognize what their legacy had become, or whether recognition no longer mattered. Doctrine had hardened into law. Law had replaced judgment, and judgment, once removed, left no room for mercy, only repetition. As Malia descended the tower, orders already arriving for the next symbolic deployment, she understood with chilling certainty that the system was no longer choosing its path. It was following a track laid centuries ago, unable to stop, unable to turn, grinding forward until there was nothing left to inherit. The reprimand arrived 3 days later, delivered with the same tone one might use for a commendation. Captain Maelia Vaughan was summoned to a doctrinal hearing chamber carved directly into the hive's bedrock. Its walls lined with engraved excerpts from the Primarch's campaign maxims. No restraints, no raised voices, only the quiet pressure of expectation pressing from every surface. The officers present spoke of concern, of alignment, of the importance of preserving spiritual cohesion during prolonged crisis. Her actions at the Shrine Fortress, they explained, had been effective, but effectiveness alone was not the metric by which faith-based command could be evaluated. Malia listened without interruption. She had learned when silence was safer than defense. The presiding authority cited passages describing the Primarch's refusal to yield ground under far worse conditions, though the context of those passages had been simplified into something closer to parable than history. When Maelia attempted to clarify the tactical realities, the enemy's fire patterns, the communications failures, the response was gentle but firm. Reality, she was reminded, was mutable. Doctrine was not. The outcome was predictable. She was not demoted. That would have implied wrongdoing. Instead, she was reassigned. The phrasing was careful. She was being preserved, not punished. Preserved as an example of correction rather than a source of deviation. Among the troops, the change was felt immediately. New commanders arrived, men whose records were immaculate and whose loyalty to precedent was unquestioned. They spoke often of the Primarch, less of the enemy. Orders became simpler, less responsive, more absolute. The soldiers adjusted, because adjustment was what they had always done. They fought harder, died faster, and were praised more frequently for both. In the hives, the consequences compounded. Manufactoria pushed past failure thresholds.
their machinery cannibalized to keep legacy production lines intact. Servitors collapsed in greater numbers, replaced without ceremony. Civilians disappeared into recruitment quotas that no longer pretended to be temporary.
The system was being hollowed out, one approved sacrifice at a time. Maelia watched it all from the margins. Her authority reduced, but her awareness sharpened. She saw how reports were curated before reaching higher command, how the Primarch's name was used to seal arguments before they could be made. She began to understand that the legacy was no longer merely influential. It was self-correcting. Any outcome, no matter how catastrophic, could be reframed as validation, so long as it followed the proper pattern. The realization was devastating in its simplicity. The system did not need enemies to destroy it. It was perfectly capable of doing that itself, provided it continued honoring the past with sufficient enthusiasm. As the next campaign cycle loomed, another symbolic site, another doctrinally mandated stand, Maelia felt the last illusions of reform slip away. Chapter 2 closed not with rebellion or despair, but with the quiet certainty that the system had crossed into a state from which correction was impossible. From here on, only consequences remained. The campaign that followed was never described as desperate, even as desperation soaked every level of the system like rust creeping through steel. Official communiques spoke of consolidation and doctrinal reaffirmation. Internally, it was understood as attrition management. The system no longer planned for victory in any meaningful sense. It planned for endurance measured in acceptable loss curves, for battles fought long enough to justify the past rather than secure the future. And at the center of it all stood the Primarch's legacy, invoked so frequently it began to feel less like guidance and more like gravity. Maelia Vaughn watched the shift from her new position with a clarity that bordered on cruelty. Removed from direct command, she was now tasked with oversight, reviewing troop readiness, validating doctrinal compliance, ensuring that formations matched the sanctioned patterns recorded in campaign codices older than the hive spires themselves. It was a role designed to neutralize her instincts without silencing her entirely. She could see everything. She could change nothing. The next major engagement unfolded along the system's outer industrial ring, where ancient manufacturer moons orbited in slow decay, their surfaces riddled with half-abandoned facilities and rusting void docks. Intelligence suggested the enemy was massing there, not for symbolism, but for resources. It was the most obvious target in the system, which made it doctrinally irrelevant. The Command Council chose instead to commit the bulk of its forces to a defensive stand around a reliquary world, whose only remaining value was historical. The Primarch had once spoken there. That was deemed sufficient. The outer ring was left thinly held. Maelia read the deployment orders in silence, feeling a familiar tightening in her chest. She could trace the outcome without speculation. The enemy would take the ring, strip it, and turn its infrastructure against the system. Supply lines would collapse. Reinforcements would arrive too late, or not at all. The response, when it came, would be framed as a test of faith, rather than a failure of planning. She annotated the margins of her data slate anyway, noting the discrepancies, flagging the risks in language as neutral and bloodless as she could manage. The annotations vanished into the system without echo. When the reports began to arrive, they were worse than projected. The enemy did not merely raid the outer ring, it settled. Void docks were repurposed, manufactorum cores were gutted and reactivated under alien control. Vox traffic became erratic, then hostile. The system's logistical spine was severed in less than a month. Civilians in the inner worlds felt the effects almost immediately. Ration reductions, power rationing, labor extensions framed as emergency measures. The ecclesiarchy responded with sermons emphasizing purification through hardship. The Primarch's name was spoken more often than ever. Within the Astra Militarum, the loss triggered a familiar response. Reinforce tradition, drill harder, tighten formations. Officers were instructed to remind their troops that the Primarch had prevailed under worse conditions, that adaptation was a temptation toward weakness. Maelia watched training exercises conducted on parade grounds, scarred by decades of use, movements executed with ritual precision, while real threats evolved beyond them. The past was being rehearsed endlessly while the present burned. She requested a private audience with the system's senior command, not to argue doctrine, but to present data, hard figures, enemy movements, projected timelines. The meeting was granted, brief and formal. The commanders listened, nodding at appropriate intervals. When she finished, one of them thanked her for her diligence and reminded her that the Primarch's campaigns had also faced uncertainty, that faith in proven patterns had carried humanity through darker hours than these. The implication was unspoken but unmistakable. If the system failed, it would not be because doctrine was wrong. It would be because the system had not been faithful enough. As Melia left the chamber, she passed beneath another relief bearing the Primarch's sigil, freshly polished, its edges sharp despite centuries of repetition. She realized then that the system was no longer using the legacy to guide decisions. It was using it to absolve itself in advance. Outside, the hive's skies glowed faintly with distant fires from the outer ring, their light diffused by pollution and cloud. Citizens looked up and whispered prayers, convinced the glow was a sign of testing rather than warning. Shrines overflowed, candles burned down to stubs. Belief surged in response to loss, not because it offered solutions, but because it explained why solutions were unnecessary. The past refused to yield, and in refusing, it was dragging the present toward a future already written in the language of inevitability. The fall of the outer ring was never acknowledged as a loss in public discourse. It was reframed as a necessary shedding, an ordeal that would strip weakness from the system and leave only what was worthy to endure. Ecclesiarchal broadcasts spoke of trials by fire, of the Primarch's campaigns requiring sacrifice before triumph. The language was precise, practiced, and disastrously effective. People stopped asking when relief would come and began asking how much more they were expected to give. In the Imperium, that shift often marked the point of no return. Inside the hives, daily life constricted, power cycles shortened, water reclamation quotas tightened until the liquid tasted faintly of rust and chemical bitterness. Manufactorum shifts extended beyond safety margins, workers sleeping against warm machinery between alarms because returning to hab blocks wasted time and energy. Skitari patrols became a common sight in civilian corridors, their presence justified as protection but felt as surveillance. Servitors failed more frequently, collapsing mid-task and blocking production lines until their bodies were dragged aside. None of this was hidden, it was sanctified. Malia Vaughan observed the consequences ripple outward with grim predictability. Astra Militarum units, redeployed from symbolic positions, arrived exhausted and under-equipped, their numbers already thinned by battles that achieved nothing measurable. Training cycles shortened to compensate, stripping drills down to rote repetition of doctrinal movements. There was no time left for adaptation, even if it had been permitted. Officers spoke of honoring the Primarch through perseverance,
their voices steady, their eyes increasingly hollow. They believed what they said because belief was easier than reckoning.
When the enemy finally pushed inward from the outer ring, it did so along vectors that made sense only if one accepted that history no longer mattered. Supply depots fell. Void traffic became hazardous, then impossible. Requests for reinforcement piled up, routed through channels that no longer connected to anything capable of responding. Each delay was explained as a test. Each failure was reinterpreted as proof that the faithful must endure more. The Primarch's legacy had become a closed system, capable of absorbing any outcome without changing shape. Melia tried once more to intervene, this time indirectly. She worked with logisticians and junior officers, quietly coordinating local adjustments that did not openly contradict doctrine, but bent it just enough to keep people alive. Ammunition was redistributed under the guise of ceremonial allocation. Patrol routes were adjusted by citing obscure footnotes in campaign records. For a time, it helped. For a time, the bleeding slowed, but the system noticed. It always did. An audit followed, polite and thorough. Deviations were catalogued. Explanations were requested. Maelia answered carefully, grounding every action in precedent, every choice in sanctioned language. The auditors nodded, thanked her, and removed the local authority that had allowed those adjustments to occur. The system corrected itself, sealing the breach where reality had briefly intruded. The realization that followed was colder than despair. This was not incompetence. It was not even fanaticism in the crude sense. It was consistency. The legacy ensured that any attempt to adapt would be smoothed away, not because it was malicious, but because it threatened coherence. The Primarch's image had become the system's immune response, attacking anything that suggested change. As the months ground on, the system's population shrank. Not all at once, not dramatically. It thinned. People vanished into recruitment drives, into manufactorum collapses, into evacuation ships that never reached their destinations. Birth rates fell. Skolams closed entire wings. Shrines expanded to fill the empty spaces, candles burning where children's voices had once echoed. Faith did not falter. It intensified. Maelia stood one evening at a viewport overlooking the hive's industrial horizon, watching the distant glow of fires that never fully went out. She thought of the Primarch as a living being, once capable of judgment, of learning, of change under pressure. Whatever that figure had truly been, it no longer mattered. The legacy left behind had outlived context, outlived intention, and now outlived the people it claimed to protect. When the next set of orders arrived, redirecting the last mobile reserves to defend another historically significant site, Maelia did not feel anger. She felt confirmation. The system would continue to choose memory over survival until memory was all that remained. The first cracks did not appear in command channels or casualty reports. They appeared in prayer. It began subtly, as most dangerous shifts do. A phrase altered here, a line omitted there. In shrines that had stood unchanged for centuries, priests found themselves hesitating before reciting certain passages attributed to the Primarch. Not because they doubted the words, but because the words no longer fit the shape of reality pressing in around them. The faithful still knelt, candles still burned, but something in the rhythm had faltered, as if the liturgy itself were struggling to keep pace with events it was no longer equipped to explain. Maelia Vaughan noticed it during an inspection of a lower hive chapel, requisitioned as a morale station for displaced workers. The walls were thick with incense smoke, the air sour with sweat and recycled oxygen. A young priest stood before a small congregation, voice steady but eyes unfocused, delivering a sermon on endurance, drawn from one of the Primarch's lesser-known campaign texts. Halfway through, he paused. The pause was brief, barely a breath, but it rippled through the room. People shifted. Someone coughed. The priest recovered and continued, but the moment lingered like a fault line beneath the words. Afterward, Malia spoke with him privately. She did not accuse. She did not probe. She simply asked how the faithful were holding up. The priest answered honestly, because honesty felt safer in the quiet than performance ever had in public. He said people were asking questions he did not know how to answer anymore, not about faith, about application. They wanted to know whether the Primarch's will accounted for empty habs and silent golems, whether suffering that produced no relief was still sacred or merely familiar. He said these questions frightened him more than any enemy advance. Rumors began to circulate alongside those questions, half-formed and carefully unrecorded. Some claimed to have uncovered fragmented data slates, suggesting the Primarch had altered doctrine repeatedly over the course of their campaigns, adapting strategies when circumstances demanded it. Others whispered that the Primarch's most celebrated stands had been acts of necessity, not preference, moments chosen because no alternative remained, not because rigidity was virtuous. None of these claims could be verified. Most were likely distortions born of desperation, but they spread anyway, because they offered something the system had not allowed in years: possibility. The ecclesiarchy responded quickly, though never openly. Sermons were standardized. Approved texts were redistributed. Priests who deviated too far from sanctioned interpretations found themselves reassigned to quieter districts, their congregations absorbed into more stable parishes. Officially, this was pastoral care. Unofficially, it was containment. The rumor was not heresy. It was worse. It suggested that the past might not be as fixed as the system required it to be. Malia encountered the rumor again within the Astra Militarum, passed between officers in moments they believed were private. One lieutenant spoke of an apocryphal account where the Primarch had ordered a retreat to preserve forces, only for later chroniclers to recast it as a strategic feint. Another mentioned a relic world, where records contradicted current doctrine so thoroughly they had been sealed rather than reconciled. These were not calls to rebellion. They were attempts to reconcile lived experience with inherited truth, and that, Malia knew, was precisely why they were dangerous. The system could survive enemies. It had done so for centuries. What it could not survive was ambiguity in its foundational myth. The Primarch's legacy functioned because it was singular, absolute, and unquestioned. Introduce uncertainty, suggest that the Primarch might have chosen differently under different circumstances, and the entire structure trembled. If adaptation had once been permissible, then refusing it now was a choice. And choice implied responsibility. Inquisitorial attention followed, as inevitably as gravity. Not a purge, not yet, just observation, data slate audits, quiet interviews, the kind of scrutiny designed to map fault lines rather than seal them. Malia was summoned once more, this time not as an officer, but as a witness. The Inquisitor spoke calmly, asking about morale, about rumor, about whether Malia believed the Primarch's legacy was being interpreted correctly. The phrasing was careful, allowing only one safe answer. Malia gave it. Survival had taught her when truth became lethal. As she left the chamber, she passed a mural newly commissioned for a transit concourse. Fresh pigments, pristine lines. It depicted the Primarch gazing outward, arm extended, leading humanity forward. Malia stopped and looked at it for a long moment. The words were not a statement of history, they were a command, and somewhere in the system's depths, the rumor continued to move, quiet and persistent, asking the one question no authority could allow to be answered aloud. What if the Primarch would not have chosen this? The rumor did not spread like a creed. It spread like breath held too long and finally released, quietly, carefully. In places where vox grills crackled with too much static to be trusted, and where records were kept on paper because data slates invited audit. It passed between manufactorum foremen during extended shifts, between junior officers on night watch, between priests who had learned to speak with their eyes rather than their mouths. No one stated it outright. They framed it as questions, as hypotheticals, as prayers phrased poorly enough to slip past scrutiny. Maelia Vaughan encountered it again in a logistics hub near the inner docks, a cavernous space once designed for abundance and now repurposed for rationing. A clerk, hands stained with ink and machine oil, spoke too quickly when she realized Maelia was listening. She apologized at once, reflexively, but Maelia waved it away. The clerk had been explaining a discrepancy, an old routing order attributed to the Primarch that contradicted the current one being enforced. Both carried the same authority. Both could not be correct. The clerk asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, how one was meant to choose. Maelia had no answer that would not end with someone vanishing. She told the clerk to follow the current order and left before the conversation could deepen into something dangerous. As she walked away, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear this time, but something closer to grief. The system was not ignorant. It was trapped between truths it could not reconcile. The ecclesiarchy sensed the shift fully now. New devotional cycles were announced, emphasizing unity of interpretation. Choirs replaced individual prayer in larger shrines, their synchronized voices drowning out variation. Personal meditations were encouraged only under supervision. The Primarch's words were recited more often, but always the same excerpts, the same interpretations, polished until they could bear no alternative meaning. Faith was being stabilized, like a structure braced against collapse. That stabilization had consequences. In lower districts, where priests were reassigned and chapels consolidated, entire communities lost their local spiritual anchors overnight. The faithful were instructed to travel farther for sanctioned worship, through corridors now patrolled by Skitari, whose optics glowed coldly in the half-light. Attendance dropped, not from rebellion, but from exhaustion. Prayer became something done alone, quietly, dangerously. The rumor fed on that isolation. Within the Astra Militarum, the response was sharper. Officers suspected of entertaining speculative interpretations found their careers stalled. Promotions slowed. Transfers became sudden and unexplained. Training manuals were revised to remove ambiguous passages, replaced by simplified directives framed as direct extrapolations of the Primarch's will. The effect was immediate and chilling. Thought narrowed. Language flattened. Initiative disappeared not because it was forbidden outright, but because it no longer fit the shape of what was permitted. Maelia observed all of it with a detachment she had not chosen, but could not escape. She understood now that the rumor itself did not matter. Whether the Primarch had truly adapted, compromised, or changed over time was almost irrelevant. What mattered was that people believed it was possible. That belief introduced contingency into a system built on inevitability. And inevitability was the Imperium's most reliable tool. Another inquisitorial inquiry followed, broader this time, not focused on Maelia alone, but on the system as a whole. Data slates were seized. Archive access was restricted. Several minor historians disappeared from public records, their work quietly reclassified. Official communiques reassured the population that doctrinal clarity was being restored. The phrase appeared everywhere, restored, as if clarity had ever been anything other than manufactured. Myelia stood one evening in a transit concourse, watching pilgrims move past the new mural she had seen before. The Primarch's gaze was still fixed on some imagined horizon, arm extended in eternal command. Below it, candles burned in neat rows, their flames steady in the recycled air. People knelt, heads bowed, lips moving in perfect unison. From a distance, it looked like unity. Up close, Melia could see the strain in their shoulders, the way hands clenched too tightly around prayer beads. She wondered what the Primarch would think if they could see this. Not the mural, not the banners, but the system bending itself into ruin to preserve a version of them that could never be wrong. The thought was treasonous in its own way, but it no longer frightened her. Fear had been exhausted by repetition. The rumor did not promise salvation. It did not even promise survival. It promised only that the past might have been more complex than the present allowed. And in a system built on the denial of complexity, that was enough to mark it as lethal. As Myelia turned away from the concourse, another broadcast began. Vox grills carrying a familiar litany across the hive. The words washed over her without impact. She had heard them too many times, in too many variations that all meant the same thing. Thus it has always been. She knew, with quiet certainty, that this chapter of the system's story would not end with revelation. It would end with enforcement. And somewhere beyond the reach of sermons and sigils, consequences were already aligning themselves, indifferent to rumor, unmoved by legacy, waiting only for the moment when belief finally outweighed reality completely. The enforcement did not arrive with fire or proclamation. It arrived with silence. Vox feeds grew cleaner. Their static filtered out until broadcasts sounded almost soothing. Schedules stabilized. The word appeared everywhere at once, stamped onto administratum notices, spoken from ecclesiarchal pulpits, woven into training briefings and ration announcements. Normalization meant the system had accepted its new shape. Normalization meant there would be no return to what had existed before, because what had existed before was now defined as disorder. Myelia Vaughn felt it most sharply in what was no longer discussed. The rumor vanished from conversation, not because it had been disproven, but because speaking it had become exhausting. People still thought the questions, they simply learned to swallow them. In the Imperium, suppression rarely required confession or punishment. It relied on attrition, on making curiosity cost more energy than obedience. A handful of junior officers were reassigned to distant fronts, their names quietly removed from local rosters. Archive access tightened further until even sanctioned historians found entire segments of data slate history sealed behind sigils they could not override. The Primarch's legacy did not react violently to doubt. It absorbed it, diluted it, and redistributed a simpler version of itself in response. The inquisitorial presence withdrew just as quietly as it had arrived. No purges, no trials, no martyrs to inspire the wrong kind of attention. Their work was complete. The fault lines had been mapped, and the system had proven capable of sealing them. That capability, more than loyalty, was what mattered. In the Manufactoria and Hab levels, life continued its contraction. Entire districts were decommissioned, their populations relocated or drafted, their empty shells repurposed as shrine complexes and storage vaults. Children learned fewer hymns, but repeated them more often. Education shifted from history to recitation. The Primarch's words were taught not as context, but as axioms.
self-evident truths requiring no explanation. Mylia stood one last time in the lower hive chapel where she had first sensed the fracture. The young priest was gone, reassigned without notice. The congregation knelt before a standardized altar installed in his absence, its design approved and identical to thousands of others across the system. The sermon piped through hidden speakers was flawless in its delivery, not a syllable out of place. The people listened, heads bowed, shoulders sagging beneath a burden they could no longer name. She realized then that the rumor had never been about what the Primarch would have done. It had been about what the system no longer allowed itself to imagine. Choice. Adaptation. The possibility that reverence did not require repetition. Those possibilities were gone now, not erased, but rendered inert, encased in silence. The legacy had won not by proving itself right, but by making all alternatives unsustainable. As Mylia left the chapel, the words of the litany followed her into the corridor, echoing off stone and steel with perfect clarity. They sounded stronger than ever. That was how she knew the damage was complete. The end did not arrive as catastrophe. It arrived as accounting. By the time the final decision was made, the system was already functionally dead, though no one would have used that word in an official record. Its worlds still rotated, its manufactoria still produced, its banners still flew, but everything that made continuation meaningful had been stripped down to maintenance of form. Birth rates had fallen below replacement thresholds. Entire regiments existed only as names preserved on rosters long after their last members had been reassigned, killed, or absorbed elsewhere. The system endured, yes, but only as a shape. The Administratum Review came from far beyond the system, authored by officials who had never walked its hive corridors or breathed its chemical air. The language was neutral, precise, merciless. Strategic value, declining. Resource efficiency, compromised. Long-term sustainability, non-viable without disproportionate investment. The conclusion was not framed as judgment. It was framed as inevitability. The Imperium had other fronts, other systems still capable of adaptation. This one, bound to a legacy it could not bend, had become a liability. The response was calibrated rather than dramatic. No immediate exterminatus. That was reserved for threats, not relics. Instead, evacuation priorities were issued, partial, selective, and brutally pragmatic. Skilled laborers were reassigned. Gene stock, deemed valuable, was extracted. Ecclesiarchal relics were catalogued and prepared for transfer. What remained was categorized as acceptable loss, to be managed rather than mourned. The Primarch's legacy, preserved in archives and doctrine, would survive. The system that had carried it would not. Melia Vaughan read the notice in a quiet chamber overlooking the hive's central manufactorum stacks. She felt no shock, only a strange, hollow confirmation. Everything the system had done, every refusal to adapt, every sacrifice framed as virtue, had led here with perfect internal logic. The legacy had not failed. It had succeeded exactly as designed, proving its purity by consuming everything that could not conform to it. As withdrawal began, the tone of official broadcasts shifted once more. The language softened. The faithful were praised for their centuries of endurance. Their suffering was declared meaningful, their loyalty unquestioned. They were told they had held long enough, that their vigil had been seen. There would be no mention of misinterpretation, no acknowledgement of error. History would record the system as an example of steadfastness under impossible odds, its loss framed as noble rather than avoidable. On the streets, the reaction was muted.
There were no riots, no mass protests. People queued where they were told to queue, boarded transports if their names appeared on lists, returned to their habs if they did not. Generations raised to equate obedience with survival adapted seamlessly to abandonment. Faith did not collapse. It narrowed, focusing inward, clinging harder to the only structure it had ever known. Malia walked through districts already marked for decommissioning, past hab blocks sealed with sigils indicating future reclamation or sterilization. Shrines still burned within, candles flickering before icons that would soon be removed or buried. She thought of the Primarch again, not as mural or doctrine, but as a living being who had once made decisions under pressure, who had learned, adapted, and changed because survival demanded it. That complexity had been flattened into something eternal and unforgiving. In the final days, as evacuation ships lifted from the system's remaining spaceports, Maelia stood on a platform overlooking the void. She watched the last banners being lowered, their fabric carefully folded for transport, treated with more care than the people left behind. The Primarch's sigil remained immaculate, untouched by the collapse it had overseen. The system would not be remembered as a failure. It would be remembered as proof. Proof that legacy could outlive context. Proof that belief, when made immutable, could become more destructive than any enemy fleet. Proof that extinction did not always arrive from outside the Imperium, but could grow patiently from within, sanctified by memory and enforced by reverence. As the final records were sealed and the last authorized vessels departed, the system slipped into quiet irrelevance. Its stars would continue to burn for millennia. Its worlds would cool slowly, long after anyone remembered their names. Somewhere else, on some other world, the Primarch's legacy would be invoked again, carried forward unchanged. And that was the true extinction event. Not the loss of a star system, but the certainty that the lesson would never be learned.